Actions and Reactions by Rudyard Kipling. An Habitation Enforced. My friend, if cause doth rest thee, ere folly hath much oppressed thee, far from acquaintance cast thee, where country may digest thee, thank God that so hath blessed thee, and sit down, Robin, and rest thee. Thomas Tusser. It came without warning at the very hour his hand was outstretched to crumble the Holts and Gunsberg combine. The New York doctors called it overwork, and he lay in a darkened room, one ankle crossed above the other, tongue pressed into palate, wondering whether the next brain surge of prickly fires would drive his soul from all anchorages. At last they gave judgment. With care he might in 2 years return to the arena, but for the present he must go across the water and do not work whatever. He accepted the terms. It was capitulation, but the combine that had shivered beneath his knife gave him all the honours of war. Gunsberg himself, full of condolences, came to the steamer and filled the Chapin's suite of cabins with overwhelming flower-works. "Smilax," said George Chapin when he saw them, "Fitz is right. I'm dead, only I don't see why he left out the in memoriam on the ribbons." "Nonsense," his wife answered, and poured him his tincture. "You'll be back before you can think." He looked at himself in the mirror, surprised that his face had not been branded by the hells of the past 3 months. The noise of the decks worried him, and he lay down, his tongue only a little pressed against his palate. An hour later he said, "Sophie, I feel sorry about taking you away from everything like this. I suppose we're the 2 loneliest people on God's earth tonight," said Sophie, his wife, and kissed him. "Isn't it something to you that we're going together?" They drifted about Europe for months, sometimes alone, sometimes with chance-met gypsies of their own land. From the North Cape to the Blue Grotto at Capri they wandered, because the next steamer headed that way, or because someone had set them on the road. The doctors had warned Sophie that Chapin was not to take interest even in other men's interests, but a familiar sensation at the back of the neck after 1 hour's keen talk with the now hymned railway magnate saved her any trouble. He nearly wept. "And I'm over 30, he said, with all I meant to do." "Let's call it a honeymoon," said Sophie. "Do you know, in all the 6 years we've been married, you've never told me what you meant to do with your life." "With my life? What's the use? It's finished now." Sophie looked up quickly from the Bay of Naples. "As far as my business goes, I shall have to live on my rents, like that architect at St. Moritz." "You'll get better if you don't worry, and even if it takes time, there are worse things than—" "How much have you?" "Between 4 and 5 million. But it isn't the money. You know it isn't. It's the principle. How could you respect me? You never did the first year after we married, till I went to work like the others. Our tradition and upbringing are against it. We can't accept those ideals." "Well, I suppose I married you for some sort of ideal," she answered, and they returned to their 43rd hotel. In England they missed the alien tongues of continental streets that reminded them of their own polyglot cities. In England all men spoke one tongue, speciously like American to the ear, but on cross-examination unintelligible. But you have not seen England," said a lady with iron-grey hair. They had met her in Vienna, Bayreuth, and Florence, and were grateful to find her again at Claridge's, for she commanded situations and knew where prescriptions are most carefully made up. "You ought to take an interest in the home of our ancestors, as I do." "I've tried for a week, Mrs. Shantz," said Sophie, "but I never get any further than tipping German waiters." "These are not the true types," Mrs. Shantz went on. "I know where you should go." Chapin pricked up his ears, anxious to run anywhere from the streets on which quick men, something of his kidney, did the business denied to him. "We hear and we obey, Mrs. Shantz," said Sophie, feeling his unrest as he drank the loathed British tea. Mrs. Shantz smiled and took them in hand. She wrote widely and telegraphed far on their behalf, till, armed with her letter of introduction, she drove them into that wilderness which is reached from an ash barrel of a station called Charing Cross, They were to go to Rockets, the farm of one Cloak, in the southern counties, where she assured them they would meet the genuine England of folklore and song. Rockets they found after some hours, 4 miles from a station, and so far as they could judge in the bumpy darkness, twice as many from a road. Trees, kine, and the outlines of barns showed shadowy about them when they alighted, and Mr. and Mrs. Cloak at the open door of a deep stone-floored kitchen made them shyly welcome. They lay in an attic beneath a wavy whitewashed ceiling, and because it rained, a wood fire was made in an iron basket on a brick hearth, and they fell asleep to the chirping of mice and the whimper of flames. When they woke, it was a fair day, full of the noises of birds, the smell of bogs, lavender, and fried bacon mixed with an elemental smell they had never met before. "This," said Sophie, nearly pushing out the thin casement in an attempt to see round the corner, "is what did the hack cabman say to the railway porter about my trunk? Quite on the top?" "No, a little bit of all right. I feel further away from anywhere than I've ever felt in my life. We must find out where the telegraph office is." "Who cares?" said Sophie, wandering about, hairbrush in hand, to admire the illustrated weekly pictures pasted on door and cupboard. But there was no rest for the alien soul till he had made sure of the telegraph office. He asked the Cloak's daughter, laying breakfast while Sophie plunged her face in the lavender bush outside the low window. "Go to the stile at top of the barn field," said Mary, "and look across Pardon's to the next spire. It's directly under. You can't miss it. Not if you keep to the footpath. My sister's the telegraphist there, but you're in the 3-mile radius, sir. The boy delivers telegrams directly to this door from Pardon's village." "One has to take a good deal on trust in this country," he murmured. Sophie looked at the close turf, scarred only with last night's wheels, at 2 ruts which wound round a rickyard, and at the circle of still orchard about the half-timbered house. "What's the matter with it?" she said. "Telegrams delivered to the Vale of Avalon, of course." And she beckoned in an earnest-eyed hound of engaging manners and no engagements, who answered at times to the name of Rumbler. He led them, after breakfast, to the rise behind the house where the stile stood against the skyline, and "I wonder what we shall find now," said Sophie, frankly prancing with joy on the grass. It was a slope of gap-hedged fields possessed to their centres by clumps of brambles. Gates were not, and the rabbit-mined, cattle-wrapped posts leaned out and in. A narrow path doubled among the bushes. Scores of white tails twinkled before the racing hound, and a hawk rose whistling shrilly. "No roads, no nothing," said Sophie, her short skirt hooked by briars. "I thought all England was a garden. There's your spire, George, across the valley. How curious!" They walked toward it through an all-abandoned land. Here they found the ghost of a patch of lucerne that had refused to die. There a harsh fallow surrendered to yard-high thistles, and here a breadth of rampant kelk, feigning to be lawful crop. In the ungrazed pastures swaths of dead stuff caught their feet, and the ground beneath glistened with sweat. At the bottom of the valley a little brook had undermined its footbridge, and frothed in the wreckage. But there stood great woods on the slopes beyond, old, tall, and brilliant, like unfaded tapestries against the walls of a ruined house. "All this within 100 miles of London," he said. "Looks as if it had had nervous prostration too." The footpath turned the shoulder of the slope, through a thicket of rank rhododendrons, and crossed what had once been a carriage drive, which ended in the shadow of 2 gigantic holm oaks. "A house," said Sophie in a whisper. "A colonial house." Behind the blue-green of the twin trees rose a dark bluish brick Georgian pile, with a shell-shaped fanlight over its pillared door. The hound had gone off on his own foolish quests. Except for some stir in the branches and the fright of 4 startled magpies, there was neither life nor sound about the square house, but it looked out of its long windows most friendlily. "Charmed to meet you, I'm sure," said Sophie, and curtsied to the ground. "George, this is history I can understand. We began here," she curtsied again. The June sunshine twinkled on all the lights. It was as though an old lady, wise in 3 generations' experience, but for the present sitting out, bent to listen to her flushed and eager grandchild. I must look. Sophie tiptoed to a window and shaded her eyes with her hand. Oh, this room's half full of cotton bales, wool, I suppose. But I can see a bit of the mantelpiece. George, do come. Isn't that someone? She fell back behind her husband. The front door opened slowly to show the hound, his nose white with milk, in charge of an ancient of days, clad in a blue linen ephod curiously gathered on breast and shoulders. Certainly, said George half aloud. Father Time himself. This is where he lives, Sophie. We came, said Sophie weakly. Can we see the house? I'm afraid that's our dog. No, 'tis Rumbler, said the old man. He's been at my swill pail again. Staying at Rocket, be ye? Come in. Ah, you run a gate. The hound broke from him, and he tottered after him down the drive. They entered the hall, just such a high-light hall as such a house should own. A slim balustered staircase, wide and shallow, and once creamy white, climbed out of it under a long oval window. On either side, delicately moulded doors gave on to wool-lumbered rooms, whose sea-green mantelpieces were adorned with nymphs, scrolls, and cupids in low relief. "What's the firm that makes these things?" cried Sophie enraptured. "Oh, I forgot. This must be the originals. Adams, is it? I never dreamed of anything like that steel-cut fender. Does he mean us to go everywhere?" "He's catching the dog," said George, looking out. "We don't count." They explored the first or ground floor, delighted as children playing burglars. "This is like all England," she said at last. "Wonderful, but no explanation. You're expected to know it beforehand. Now let's try upstairs." The stairs never creaked beneath their feet. From the broad landing they entered a long, green-panelled room, lighted by 3 full-length windows, which overlooked the forlorn wreck of a terraced garden and wooded slopes beyond. "The drawing-room, of course." Sophie swam up and down it. "That mantelpiece, Orpheus and Eurydice, is the best of them all. Isn't it marvellous? Why, the room seems furnished with nothing in it. How's that, George?" "It's the proportions. I've noticed it." "I saw a Hepplewhite couch once," Sophie said, her finger to her flushed cheek, and considered. "With 2 of them, one on each side, you wouldn't need anything else, except there must be one perfect mirror over the mantelpiece." "Look at that view. It's a framed constable," her husband cried. "No, it's a moorland, a parody of a moorland. But about that couch, George, don't you think Empire might be better than Hepplewhite? Dull gold against the pale green. It's a pity they don't make spinets nowadays." "I believe you can get them. Look at that oak wood behind the pines." "While you sat and played toccatas stately at the clavichord," Sophie hummed, and, head on one side, nodded to where the perfect mirror should hang. Then they found bedrooms, with dressing-rooms and powdering closets, and steps leading up and down, boxes of rooms, round, square, and octagonal, with enriched ceilings and chased door-locks. Now about servants. Oh! She had darted up the last stairs to the checkered darkness of the top floor, where loose tiles lay among broken laths, and the walls were scrawled with names, sentiments, and hop records. "They've been keeping pigeons here," she cried. "And you could drive a buggy through the roof anywhere," said George. "That's what I say," the old man cried below them on the stairs. "Not a dry place for my pigeons at all." "But why was it allowed to get like this?" said Sophie. "'Tis with housen as 'tith," he replied. "Let 'em go too far, and there's nothing to be done. Time was they was minded to sell her, but none would buy. She was too far away along from any place. Time was they had lived here theyselves, but they took and died." "Here?" Sophie moved beneath the light of a hole in the roof. "Nah, none dies here except falling off ricks and such. In London they died." He plucked a lock of wool from his blue smock. "There was no staple, neither the Elphics nor the Moons. Short and brittle all of them. Dead they be 17 year, for I've been here caretaking 25. Who does all the wool belong to downstairs? George asked. To the estate. I'll show you the back parts if you like. You're from America, ain't ye? I've had a son there once myself. They followed him down the main stairway. He paused at the turn and swept one hand towards the wall. Plenty room here for your coffin to come down. 7 foot and 3 men at each end wouldn't breach the paint. If I die in my bed, they'll have to upend me like a milk can. 'Tis all luck, d'ye see? He led them on and on through a maze of back kitchens, dairies, larders, and sculleries that melted along covered ways into a farmhouse, visibly older than the main building, which again rambled out among barns, byres, pig pens, stalls, and stables to the dead fields behind. Somehow, said Sophie, sitting exhausted on an ancient well-curb, somehow one wouldn't insult these lovely old things by filling them with hay. George looked at long stone walls upholding reaches of silvery oak, weather-boarding, buttresses of mixed flint and bricks, outside stairs, stone upon arched stone, curves of thatch where grass sprouted, roundels of house-licked tiles, and a huge paved yard populated by 2 cows and the repentant rambler. He had not thought of himself or of the telegraph office for 2.5 hours. But why, said Sophie, as they went back through the crater of stricken fields, why is one expected to know everything in England? Why do they never tell? You mean about the Elphics and the Moons? He answered. Yes, and the lawyers and the estate. Who are they? I wonder whether those painted floors in the green room were real oak. Don't you like us exploring things together, better than Pompeii? George turned once more to look at the view. 800 acres go with the house, the old man told me. 5 farms altogether. Rockets is one of them. I like Mrs. Cloak, but what is the old house called? George laughed. That's one of the things you're expected to know. He never told me. The Cloaks were more communicative. That evening, and thereafter for a week, they gave the Chapins the official history, as one gives it to lodgers, of Friar's Pardon, the house, and its 5 farms. But Sophie asked so many questions, and George was so humanly interested, that, as confidence in the strangers grew, they launched, with observed and acquired detail, into the lives and deaths and doings of the Elphics and the Moons, and their collaterals, the Halings and the Torrals. It was a tale told serially by Cloak in the barn or his wife in the dairy, the last chapters reserved for the kitchen o' nights by the big fire, when the two had been half the day exploring about the house, where old Eagledon of the blue smock cackled and chuckled to see them. The motives that swayed the characters were beyond their comprehension. The fates that shifted them were gods they had never met. The sidelights Mrs. Cloak threw on act and incident were more amazing than anything in the record. Therefore the Chapins listened delightedly and blessed Mrs. Shonts. But why did so-and-so do so-and-so? Sophie would demand from her seat by the pot-hook, and Mrs. Cloak would answer, smoothing her knees. For the sake of the place. I give it up, said George one night in their own room. People don't seem to matter in this country compared to the places they live in. The way she tells it, Friar's Pardon was a sort of Moloch. Poor old thing! They had been walking round the farms as usual before tea. No wonder they loved it. Think of the sacrifices they made for it. Jane Elphick married the younger Torrell to keep it in the family. The octagonal room with the moulded ceiling next to the big bedroom was hers. Now, what did he tell you while he was feeding the pigs? Said Sophie. About the Torrell cousins and the uncle who died in Java. They lived at Burnt House, behind High Pardons, where that brook is all blocked up. No, Burnt House is under High Pardons Wood before you come to Gale Unstey, Sophie corrected. Well, old man Cloak said. Sophie threw open the door and called down into the kitchen where the Cloaks were covering the fire. Mrs. Cloak, isn't Burnt House under High Pardons? Yes, my dear, of course, the soft voice answered absently. A cough. I beg your pardon, madam? What was it you said? Never mind, I prefer it the other way. Sophie laughed, and George retold the missing chapter as she sat on the bed. "Here today and gone tomorrow," said Cloak warningly. "They've paid their first month, but we've only that Mrs. Shant's letter for guarantee. None she sent never cheated us yet. It slipped out before I thought. She's a most humane young lady. They'll be going away in a little. And you've talked a lot too, Alfred." "Yes, but the Elphics are all dead. No one can bring my loose talking home to me. But why do they stay on and stay on so?" In due time George and Sophie asked each other that question and put it aside. They argued that the climate, a pearly blend, unlike the hot and cold ferocities of their own native land, suited them as the thick stillness of the night certainly suited George. He was saved even the sight of a metalled road, which, as presumably leading to business, wakes desire in a man, and the telegraph office at the village of Friar's Pardon, where they sold picture postcards and peg tops, was 2 walking miles across the fields and woods. For all that touched his past among his fellows, on their remembrance of him, he might have been in another planet, and Sophie, whose life had been very largely spent among husbandless wives of lofty ideals, had no wish to leave this present of God. The unhurried meals, the foreknowledge of deliciously empty hours to follow, the breadths of soft sky under which they walked together and reckoned time only by their hunger or thirst, the good grass beneath their feet that cheated the miles, their discoveries always together amid the farms, Griffins, Rockets, Burnt House, Gale Anstey, and the home farm, where Eagledon of the blue smock frock would waylay them, and they would ransack the old house once more, the long wet afternoons when they tucked up their feet on the bedroom's deep window-sill over against the apple trees and talked together as never till then had they found time to talk. These things contented her soul, and her body throve. "Have you realized," she asked one morning, "that we've been here absolutely alone for the last 34 days?" "Have you counted them?" he asked. "Did you like them?" she replied. "I must have. I didn't think about them. Yes, I have. 6 months ago I should have fretted myself sick. Remember at Cairo? I've only had 2 or 3 bad times. Am I getting better, or is it senile decay?" "Climate, all climate." Sophie swung her new-bought English boots as she sat on the stile overlooking Friar's Pardon behind the Cloaks' barn. "One must take hold of things, though," he said, "if it's only to keep one's hand in." His eyes did not flicker now as they swept the empty fields. "Mustn't one?" "Lay out a Morristown links over Gale Ansley. I dare say you could hire it." "No, I'm not as English as that, nor as Morristown. Clock says all the farms here could be made to pay." "Well, I'm Anastasia in the Treasure of Frankfurt. I'm content to be alive and purr. There's no hurry." "No," he smiled. "All the same, I'm going to see after my mail." "You promised you wouldn't have any." "There's some business coming through that's amusing me. Honest, it doesn't get on my nerves at all." "Want a secretary?" "No, thanks, old thing. Isn't that quite English?" "Too English." "Go away." But none the less, in broad daylight, she returned the kiss. "I'm off to Pardon's. I haven't been to the house for nearly a week." "How have you decided to furnish Jane Elphick's bedroom?" He laughed, for it had come to be a permanent castle in Spain between them. "Black Chinese furniture and yellow silk brocade," she answered, and ran downhill. She scattered a few cows at a gap with a flourish of a ground ash that Eagledon had cut for her a week ago, and singing as she passed under the holm oaks, sought the farmhouse at the back of Friar's Pardon. The old man was not to be found, and she knocked at his half-opened door, for she needed him to fill her idle forenoon. A blue-eyed sheep-dog, a new friend and Rambler's old enemy, crawled out and besought her to enter. Eagledon sat in his chair by the fire, a thistle-spud between his knees, his head drooped. Though she had never seen death before, her heart, that missed a bit, told her that he was dead. She did not speak or cry, but stood outside the door, and the dog licked her hand. When he threw up his nose, she heard herself saying, "Don't howl. Please don't begin to howl, Scotty, or I shall run away." She held her ground while the shadows in the rickyard moved toward noon, sat after a while, on the steps by the door, her arms round the dog's neck, waiting till someone should come. She watched the smokeless chimneys of Friar's Pardon slush its roofs with shadow, and the smoke of Iggulden's last lighted fire gradually thin and cease. Against her will she fell to wondering how many moons, Elphics and Torals had been swung around the turn of the broad hall stairs. Then she remembered the old man's talk of being upended like a milk can, and buried her face in Scotty's neck. At last a horse's feet clinked upon flags, rustled in the old grey straw of the rickyard, and she found herself facing the vicar, a figure she had seen at church declaiming impossibilities. Sophie was a Unitarian, in an unnatural voice. "He's dead," she said without preface. "Old Iggulden? I was coming for a talk with him." The vicar passed in uncovered. "Ah," she heard him say, "heart failure. How long have you been here?" "Since 11:15. She looked at her watch earnestly and saw that her hand did not shake. "I'll sit with him now till the doctor comes. Do you think you could tell him, and yes, Mrs. Betts in the cottage with the wisteria next the blacksmith's? I'm afraid this has been rather a shock to you." Sophie nodded and fled toward the village. Her body failed her for a moment. She dropped beneath a hedge and looked back at the great house. In some fashion, its silence and stolidity steadied her for her errand. Mrs. Betts, small, black-eyed, and dark, was almost as unconcerned as Friar's Pardon. "Yes, yes, of course, dear me. Well, Iggulden, he had had his day in my father's time. Muriel, get me my little blue bag, please." "Yes, ma'am. They come down like elm branches in still weather. No warning at all. Muriel, my bicycle's behind the fowl house. I'll tell Dr. Dallas, ma'am." She trundled off on her wheel like a brown bee, while Sophie, heaven above and earth beneath changed, walked stiffly home, to fall over George at his letters in a muddle of laughter and tears. "It's all quite natural for them," she gasped. "They come down like elm branches in still weather. Yes, ma'am. No, there wasn't anything in the least horrible, only, oh, George, that poor shiny stick of his between his poor thin knees. I couldn't have borne it if Scotty had howled. I didn't know the vicar was so sensitive. He said he was afraid it was rather a shock. Mrs. Betts told me to go home, and I wanted to collapse on her floor, but I didn't disgrace myself. I couldn't have left him, could I?" "You're sure you've taken no harm?" cried Mrs. Cloak, who had heard the news by farm telegraphy, which is older but swifter than Marconi's. "No, I'm perfectly well," Sophie protested. "You lay down till tea time." Mrs. Cloak patted her shoulder. "They'll be very pleased, though she has had no proper understanding for 20 years. "They" came before twilight, a black-bearded man in moleskins and a little palsied old woman who chirruped like a wren. "I'm his son," said the man to Sophie among the lavender bushes. "We had a difference 20 year back, and didn't speak since. But I'm his son all the same, and we thank you for the watching." "I'm only glad I happened to be there," she answered, and from the bottom of her heart she meant it. "We heard he spoke a lot of you, one time and another since you came. We thank you kindly," the man added. "Are you the son that was in America?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am. On my uncle's farm in Connecticut. He was what they call roadmaster there." "Whereabouts in Connecticut?" asked George over her shoulder. "Bearing Holler was the name. I was there 6 years with my uncle." "How small the world is!" Sophie cried. "Why, all my mother's people come from Bearing Hollow. There must be some there still. The Lashmars, did you ever hear of them?" "I remember hearing that name, seems to me," he answered, but his face was blank as the back of a spade. A little before dusk, a woman in grey, striding like a foot soldier and bearing on her arm a long pole, crashed through the orchard calling for food. George, upon whom the unannounced English worked mysteriously, fled to the parlour, but Mrs. Cloak came forward beaming. Sophie could not escape. "We've only just heard of it," said the stranger, turning on her. "I've been out with the otter hounds all day. It was a splendidly sporting thing. Did you, kill? Said Sophie. She knew from books she could not go far wrong here. Yes, a dry bitch, 17 pounds, was the answer. A splendidly sporting thing of you to do. Poor old Eagledon. Oh, that, said Sophie, enlightened. If there had been any people at Pardon's, it would never have happened. He'd have been looked after. But what can you expect from a parcel of London solicitors? Mrs. Cloak murmured something. No, I'm soaked from the knees down. If I hang about, I shall get chilled. A cup of tea, Mrs. Cloak, and I can eat one of your sandwiches as I go. She wiped her weather-worn face with a green and yellow silk handkerchief. Yes, my lady, Mrs. Cloak ran and returned swiftly. Our land marches with Pardons for a mile on the south, she explained, waving the full cap, but one has quite enough to do with one's own people without poaching. Still, if I'd known, I'd have sent Dora, of course. Have you seen her this afternoon, Mrs. Cloak? No? I wonder whether that girl did sprain her ankle. Thank you. It was a formidable hunk of bread and bacon that Mrs. Cloak presented. As I was saying, Pardons is a scandal. Letting people die like dogs. There ought to be people there who do their duty. You've done yours, though there wasn't the faintest call upon you. Good night. Tell Dora if she comes I've gone on. She strode away, munching her crust, and Sophie reeled breathless into the parlour to shake the shaking George. Why did you keep catching my eye behind the blind? Why didn't you come out and do your duty? Because I should have burst. Did you see the mud on its cheek? He said. Once. I daren't look again. Who is she? God. A local deity, then. Anyway, she's another of the things you're expected to know by instinct. Mrs. Cloak, shocked at their levity, told them that it was Lady Conant, wife of Sir Walter Conant, Baronet, a large landholder in the neighbourhood, and if not God, at least his visible providence. George made her talk of that family for an hour. Laughter, said Sophie afterward in their own room, is the mark of the savage. Why couldn't you control your emotions? It's all real to her. It's all real to me. That's my trouble, he answered in an altered tone. Anyway, it's real enough to mark time with. Don't you think so? What do you mean? She asked quickly, though she knew his voice. That I'm better. I'm well enough to kick. What at? This? He waved his hand around the one room. I must have something to play with till I'm fit for work again. Oh! She sat on the bed and leaned forward, her hands clasped. I wonder if it's good for you. We've been better here than anywhere, he went on slowly. One could always sell it again. She nodded gravely, but her eyes sparkled. The only thing that worries me is what happened this morning. I want to know how you feel about it. If it's on your nerves in the least, we can have the old farm at the back of the house pulled down, or perhaps it has spoiled the notion for you. Pull it down? She cried. You've no business faculty. Why, that's where we could live while we're putting the big house in order. It's almost under the same roof. No, what happened this morning seemed to be more of a leading than anything else. There ought to be people at Pardon's. Lady Conan's quite right. I was thinking more of the woods and the roads. I could double the value of the place in 6 months. What do they want for it? She shook her head, and her loosened hair fell glowingly about her cheeks. $75,000. They'll take 68. Less than half what we paid for our old yacht when we married, and we didn't have a good time in her. You were... Well, I discovered I was too much of an American to be content to be a rich man's son. You aren't blaming me for that? Oh, no, only it was a very businesslike honeymoon. How far are you along with the deal, George? I can mail the deposit on the purchase money tomorrow morning, and we can have the thing completed in a fortnight or 3 weeks, if you say so. Friar's pardon, friar's pardon, Sophie chanted rapturously, her dark grey eyes big with delight. All the farms? Gale, Ansley, Burnt House, Rockets, the home farm, and Griffin's? Sure you've got 'em all? Sure, he smiled. And the woods, High Pardon's Wood, Lower Pardon's, Sutton's, Dutton's Shaw, Reuben's Gill, Max's Gill, and both Fiocc hangers? Sure you've got 'em all? Every last stick. Why, you know them as well as I do, he laughed. They say there's 5,000, £1,000 worth of lumber. Timber, they call it, in the hangars alone. Mrs. Cloak's oven must be mended first thing, and the kitchen roof. I think I'll have all this whitewashed, Sophie broke in, pointing to the ceiling. The whole place is a scandal. Lady Conant is quite right. George, when did you begin to fall in love with the house? In the green room, that first day? I did. I'm not in love with it. One must do something to mark time till one's fit for work. Or when we stood under the oaks and the door opened. Oh, ought I to go to poor Eggleton's funeral? She sighed with utter happiness. Wouldn't they call it a liberty now? Said he. But I liked him. But you didn't own him at the date of his death. That wouldn't keep me away, only they made such a fuss about the watching. She caught her breath. It might be ostentatious from that point of view, too. Oh, George! She reached for his hand. We're two little orphans moving in worlds not realized, and we shall make some bad breaks, but we're going to have the time of our lives. We'll run up to London tomorrow and see if we can hurry those English law solicitors. I want to get to work. They went. They suffered many things ere they returned across the fields in a fly one Saturday night, nursing a 2 by 2.5 box of deeds and maps, lawful owners of Friar's Pardon and the 5 decayed farms therewith. I do most sincerely hope and trust you'll be happy, madam, Mrs. Cloak gasped, when she was told the news by the kitchen fire. Goodness, it isn't a marriage, Sophie exclaimed, a little awed, for to them the joke, which to an American means work, was only just beginning. If it's took in a proper spirit, Mrs. Cloak's eye turned toward her oven. Send and have that mended tomorrow, Sophie whispered. We couldn't help noticing, said Cloak slowly, from the times you walked there, that you and your lady was drawn to it, but I don't know as we ever precisely thought. His wife's glance checked him. That we were that sort of people? Said George. We aren't sure of it ourselves yet. Perhaps, said Cloak, rubbing his knees, just for the sake of saying something, perhaps you'll park it? What's that? Said George. Turn it all into a fine park like Violet Hill. He jerked a thumb to westward. That Mr. Sangres bought. It was 4 farms, and Mr. Sangres made a fine park of them, with a herd of fallen deer. Then it wouldn't be Friar's Pardon, said Sophie, would it? I don't know as I've ever heard pardons was ever anything but wheat and wool. Only some gentlemen say that parks are less trouble than tenants. He laughed nervously. But the gentry, of course, they keep on pretty much as they was used to. I see, said Sophie. How did Mr. Sangres make his money? I never rightly heard. It was pepper and spices, or it may have been gloves. No, gloves was Sir Reginald Lee's at Marley End. Spices was Mr. Sangres. He's a Brazilian gentleman, very sunburnt like. Be sure of one thing, you won't have any trouble, said Mrs. Cloak, just before they went to bed. Now the news of the purchase was told to Mr. and Mrs. Cloak alone at 8 p.m. of a Saturday. None left the farm till they set out for church next morning. Yet, when they reached the church and were about to slip aside into their usual seats, a little beyond the font, where they could see the red furred tails of the red robes woggle and twist at ringing time, they were swept forward irresistibly, a cloak on either flank, and yet they had not walked with the cloaks, upon the ever-retiring bosom of a black-gowned verger, who ushered them into a room of a pew at the head of the left aisle, under the pulpit. This, he sighed reproachfully, is the pardon's pew, and shut them in. They could see little more than the choir boys in the chancel, but to the roots of the hair of their necks they felt the congregation behind mercilessly devouring them by look. When the wicked man turneth away, the strong alien voice of the priest vibrated under the hammer-beam roof, and a loneliness unfelt before swamped their hearts as they searched for places in the unfamiliar Church of England service. The Lord's Prayer, Our Father which art, set the seal on that desolation. Sophie found herself thinking how, in other lands, their purchase would long ere this have been discussed from every point of view in a dozen prints, forgetting that George for months had not been allowed to glance at those black and bellowing headlines. Here was nothing but silence, not even hostility. The game was up to them. The other players hid their cards and waited. Suspense, she felt, was in the air, and when her sight cleared, she saw indeed a mural tablet of a footless bird brooding upon the carven motto, "Wait a while, wait a while." At the litany George had trouble with an unstable hassock, and drew the slip of carpet under the pew seat. Sophie pushed her end back also, and shut her eyes against a burning that felt like tears. When she opened them she was looking at her mother's maiden name, fairly carved on a blue flagstone on the pew floor. Ellen Lashmar died in 1796, at the age of 27. She nudged George and pointed. Sheltered as they kneeled, they looked for more knowledge, but the rest of the slab was blank. "Ever hear of her?" he whispered. "Never knew any of us came from here. Coincidence? Perhaps, but it makes me feel better." And she smiled and winked away a tear on her lashes, and took his hand while they prayed for all women labouring of child, not in the perils of childbirth. And the sparrows, who had found their way through the guards behind the glass windows, chirped above the faded gilt and alabaster family tree of the Conants. The baronet's pew was on the right of the aisle. After service its inhabitants moved forth without haste, but so as to block effectively a dusky person with a large family who chomped in the rear. "Spices, I think," said Sophie, deeply delighted as the sanguis closed up after the Conants. "Let them get away, George." But when they came out, many folk whose eyes were one still lingered by the lych gate. "I want to see if any more Lashmars are buried here," said Sophie. "Not now. This seems to be show day. Come home quickly," he replied. A group of families, the cloaks a little apart, opened to let them through. The men saluted with jerky nods, the women with remnants of a curtsy. Only Eagledon's son, his mother on his arm, lifted his hat as Sophie passed. "Your people," said the clear voice of Lady Conant in her ear. "I suppose so," said Sophie, blushing, for they were within 2 yards of her, but it was not a question. "Then that child looks as if it were coming down with mumps. You ought to tell the mother she shouldn't have brought it to church." "I can't leave her behind, my lady," the woman said. "She'd set the house afire in a minute. She's that forward with the matches. And you, Maudie, dear." "Has Dr. Dallas seen her?" "Not yet, my lady." "He must. You can't get away, of course." My idiotic maid is coming in for her teeth tomorrow at 12. She shall pick her up at Gale Anstey, isn't it? At 11. Yes, thank you very much, my lady." "I oughtn't to have done it," said Lady Conant apologetically, "but there has been no one at Pardon's for so long that you'll forgive my poaching. Now, can't you lunch with us? The vicar usually comes too. I don't use the horses on a Sunday." She glanced at the Brazilian silver-plated chariot. "It's only a mile across the fields." You're very kind," said Sophie, hating herself because her lip trembled. "My dear," the compelling tone dropped to a soothing gurgle, "do you suppose I don't know how it feels to come to a strange country, I should say, away from one's own people? When I first left the Shires, I'm Shropshire, you know, I cried for a day and a night. But fretting doesn't make loneliness any better. Oh, here's Dora. She did sprain her leg that day." "I'm as lame as a tree still," said the tall maiden frankly. "You ought to go out with the otter hounds, Mrs. Chapin. I believe they're drawing your water next week." Sir Walter had already led off George, and the vicar came up on the other side of Sophie. There was no escaping the swift procession or the leisurely lunch, where talk came and went in low-voiced eddies that had the village for their centre. Sophie heard the vicar and Sir Walter address her husband lightly as Chapin. She also remembered many women known in a previous life who habitually addressed their husbands as Mr. Such-and-one. After lunch, Lady Conant talked to her explicitly of maternity, as that is achieved in cottages and farmhouses remote from aid, and of the duty thereto of the mistress of Pardons. A gate in a beech hedge, reached across triple lawns, let them out before tea time into the unkept south side of the land. "I want your hand, please," said Sophie as soon as they were safe among the beech boles and the lawless hollies. "Do you remember the old maid in Providence and the guitar, who heard the commissary swear and hardly reckoned herself a maiden lady afterwards? Because I'm a relative of hers. Lady Conant is— Did you find out anything about the Lashmars? He interrupted. I didn't ask. I'm going to write to Aunt Sydney about it first. Oh, Lady Conant said something at lunch about their having bought some land from some Lashmars a few years ago. I found it was at the beginning of last century. What did you say? I said, really, how interesting. Like that. I'm not going to push myself forward. I've been hearing about Mrs. Sancris's effort in that direction. And you? I couldn't see you behind the flowers. Was it very deep waters, dear? George mopped a brow already browned by outdoor exposures. Oh, no, dead easy, he answered. I've bought Friar's pardon to prevent Sir Walter's bird straying. A cock pheasant scattered through the dry leaves and exploded almost under their feet. Sophie jumped. That's one of them, said George calmly. Well, your nerves are better at any rate, said she. Did you tell him you'd bought the thing to play with? No, that was where my nerve broke down. I only made one bad break, I think. I said I couldn't see why hiring land to men to farm wasn't as much a business proposition as anything else. And what did they say? They smiled. I shall know what that smile means some day. They don't waste their smiles. Do you see that truck by Galansti? They looked down from the edge of the hangar over a cup-like hollow. People by twos and threes in their Sunday best filed slowly along the paths that connected farm to farm. I've never seen so many on our land before, said Sophie. Why is it? To show us we mustn't shut up their rights of way. Those cow tracks we've been using cross lots? Said Sophie forcibly. Yes, any one of them would cost us £2,000 each in legal expenses to close. But we don't want to, she said. The whole community would fight if we did. But it's our land. We can do what we like. It's not our land. We've only paid for it. We belong to it, and it belongs to the people. Our people, they call them. I've been to lunch with the English too. They passed slowly from one bracken-dotted field to the next, flushed with pride of ownership, plotting alterations and restorations at each turn, halting in their tracks to argue, spreading apart to embrace two views at once, or closing in to consider one. Couples moved out of their way, but smiling covertly. We shall make some bad breaks, he said at last. Together, though. You won't let anyone else in, will you? Except the contractors. This syndicate handles this proposition by its little loan. But you might feel the want of someone, she insisted. I shall, but it will be you. It's business, Sophie, but it's going to be good fun. Please God, she answered, flushing, and cried to herself as they went back to tea. It's worth it, oh, it's worth it. The repairing and moving in Friar's pardon was business of the most varied and searching, but all done English fashion, without friction. Time and money alone were asked. The rest lay in the hands of beneficent advisers from London, or spirits, male and female, called up by Mr. and Mrs. Cloak from the wastes of their farms. In the centre stood George and Sophie, a little aghast, their interests reaching out on every side. I ain't saying anything against Londoners, said Cloak, self-appointed clerk of the outer works, consulting engineer, head of the immigration bureau, and superintendent of woods and forests. But your own people won't go about to make more than a fair profit out of you. How is one to know? Said George. 5 years from now, or so on, maybe you'll be looking over your first year's accounts and, knowing what you'll know then, you'll say, well, Billy Beartap, or Old Cloak as it might be, did me proper when I was new. No man likes to have that sort of thing laid up against him. I think I see, said George, but 5 years is a long time to look ahead. I doubt if that oak Billy Beartap throwed in Reuben's gill will be fit for her drawing-room floor in less than 7, Cloak drawled. Yes, that's my work, said Sophie. Billy Beartap of Griffin's, a woodman by training and birth, a tenant farmer by misfortune of marriage, had laid his broad axe at her feet a month before. Sorry if I've committed you to another eternity. And we shan't ever know where we've gone wrong with your new carriage drive before that time either, said Cloak, ever anxious to keep the balance true, with an ounce or two in Sophie's favour. The past 4 months had taught George better than to reply. The carriage road winding up the hill was his present keen interest. They set off to look at it, and the imported American scraper which had blighted the none too sunny soul of Skim Winch, the carter. But young Eggleton was in charge now, and under his guidance Buller and Roberts, the great horses, moved mountains. "You lift her like that, and you tip her like that," he explained to the gang. "My uncle, he was roadmaster in Connecticut." "Are they roads yonder?" said Skim, sitting under the laurels. "No better than accommodation roads. Dirt, they call 'em. They'd suit you, Skim." "Why?" said the incautious Skim. "'Cause you take no hurt when you fall out of your cart drunk on a Saturday," was the answer. "I didn't last time, neither," Skim roared. After the loud laugh, old Wyburn of Gale Anstey piped feebly. "Well, dirt or no dirt, there's no denying Chappie knows a good job when he sees it. He don't build one day and destroy the next, like that nigger Sangress." "She's the one that knows her own mind," said Pinky, brother to Skim Winch, and a Napoleon among carters, who had helped to bring the grand piano across the fields in the autumn rains. "She had ought to," said Eggleton. "Whoa, Buller! She's a Lashmar. They never was double thinking." "Whoa, you found that? Has the answer come from your uncle?" said Skim, doubtful whether so remote a land as America had posts. The others looked at him scornfully. Skim was always a day behind the fair. Eggleton rested from his labours. "She's a Lashmar right enough. I started up to write to my uncle at once, the month after she said her folks came from Veering Holler." "Where there ain't any roads?" Skim interrupted, but none laughed. "My uncle, he married an American woman for his second, and she took it up like the coroner. She's a Lashmar out of the old Lashmar place, 'fore they sold to Conants. She ain't no Toot Hill Lashmar, nor any of the Crayford lot. Her folk come out of the ground here, neither chalk nor forest, but Wildishers. They sailed over to America. I've got it all writ down by my uncle's woman, in 1800 and nothing. My uncle says they're all slow begetters like." "Would they be gentry yonder now?" Skim asked. "Nah, there's no gentry in America. No matter how long you're there, it's against their law. There's only rich and poor allowed. They've been lawyers and such like over yonder for 100 years. But she's a Lashmar for all that." "Lord, what's 100 years?" said Wyburn, who had seen 78 of them. "And they ride too, from yonder. My uncle's woman rides, that you can still tell 'em by a head mark. Their hair's foxy red still, and they throw out when they walk. He's in-toed, treads like a gypsy, but you watch, and you'll see her throw out, like a colt. Your trace wants taking up." Pinky's large ears had caught the sound of voices, and as the two broke through the laurels, the men were hard at work, their eyes on Sophie's feet. She had been less fortunate in her inquiries than Eggleton, for her Aunt Sydney of Meriden, a badged and certificated daughter of the Revolution to boot, answered her inquiries with a 2-page discourse on patriotism, the leaflets of a village improvement society, of which she was president, and a demand for an overdue subscription to a factory girls' reading circle. Sophie burned it all in the Orpheus and Eurydice crate, and kept her own counsel. "What I want to know," said George, when spring was coming, and the gardens needed thought, "is who will ever pay me for my labour? I've put in at least $500,000 worth already." "Sure you're not taking too much out of yourself?" his wife asked. "Oh, no, I haven't been conscious of myself all winter." He looked at his brown English gaiters and smiled. "It's all behind me now. I believe I could sit down and think of all that, those months before we sailed." "Don't, oh, don't!" she cried. "But I must go back one day. You don't want to keep me out of business always, or do you?" He ended with a nervous laugh. Sophie sighed as she drew her own ground ash, of old Eggleton's cutting, from the whole rack. "Aren't you overdoing it too? You look a little tired," he said. "You make me tired. I'm going to Rocket's to see Mrs. Cloak about Mary." This was the sister of the telegraphist, promoted to be sewing maid at Pardon's. "Coming?" "I'm due at Burn House to see about the new well. By the way, there's a sore throat at Gale Anstey." "That's my province, don't interfere. The Wyburn children always have sore throats. They do it for jujubes. Keep away from Gale Unstead till I make sure, honey. Cloak ought to have told me. These people don't tell. Haven't you learned that yet? But I'll obey, my lord. See you later. She set off afoot, for within the 3 main roads that bounded the blunt triangle of the estate, even by night one could scarcely hear the carts on them. Wheels were not used except for farm work. The footpath served all other purposes, and, though at first they had planned improvements, they had soon fallen in with the customs of their hidden kingdom, and moved about the soft-footed ways by woodland, hedgerow, and shaw as freely as the rabbits. Indeed, for the most part, Sophie walked bareheaded beneath her helmet of chestnut hair, but she had been plagued of late by vague toothaches, which she explained to Mrs. Cloak, who asked some questions. How it came about, Sophie never knew, but after a while, behold, Mrs. Cloak's arm was about her waist, and her head was on that deep bosom behind the shut kitchen door. My dear, the elder woman almost sobbed. And you mean to tell me you never suspicioned? Why, where was you ever taught anything at all? Of course it is. It's what we've been only waiting for, all of us. Time and again I've said to Lady. She checked herself. And now we shall be as we should be. But, Sophie whimpered, and to see you building your nest so busy, pianos and books, and never thinking of a nursery. No more I did. Sophie sat bolt upright and began to laugh. Time enough yet. The fingers tapped thoughtfully on the broad knee. But they must be strange-minded folk over yonder with you. Have you thought to send for your mother? She dead? My dear, never mind. She'll be happy where she knows. 'Tis God's work, and we was only waiting for it, for you've never failed in your duty yet. It ain't your way. What did you say about my Mary's doings? Mrs. Cloak's face hardened as she pressed her chin on Sophie's forehead. If any of your girls thinks to behave arbitrary now, But they won't, my dear. I'll see they do their duty too. Be sure you'll have no trouble. When Sophie walked back across the fields, heaven and earth changed about her as on the day of old Eagleton's death. For an instant she thought of the wide turn of the staircase and the new ivory white pane that no coffin corner could scar, but presently the shadow passed in a pure wonder and bewilderment that made her reel. She leaned against one of their new gates and looked over their lands for some other stay. Well, she said resignedly, half aloud, we must try to make him feel that he isn't a third in our party, and turned the corner that looked over Friar's Pardon, giddy, sick, and faint. Of a sudden the house they had bought for a whim stood up as she had never seen it before, low-fronted, broad-winged, ample, prepared by course of generations for all such things. As it had steadied her when it lay desolate, so now that it had meaning from their few months of life within, it soothed and promised good. She went alone and quickly into the hall, and kissed either doorpost, whispering, Be good to me. You know, you've never failed in your duty yet. When the matter was explained to George, he would have sailed at once to their own land, but this Sophie forbade. I don't want science, she said. I just want to be loved, and there isn't time for that at home. Besides, she added, looking out of the window, it would be desertion. George was forced to soothe himself with linking Friar Pardon to the telegraph system of Great Britain by telephone, 3/4 of a mile of poles, put in by Wyburn and a few friends. One of these was a foreigner from the next parish. Said he, when the line was being run, There's an old Ilum right in our road. Shall I throw her? Toot Hill parish folk, neither grace nor good luck. God help 'em. Old Wyburn shouted the local proverb from 3 poles down the line. We ain't going to lay any axe iron to coffin wood here. Not till we know where we are yet a while. Swing round her, swing round. To this day, then, that sudden kink in the straight line across the upper pasture remains a mystery to Sophie and George, nor can they tell why Skim Winch, who came to his cottage under Dutton Shaw most musically drunk at 10:45 p.m. of every Saturday night, as his father had done before him, sang no more, at the bottom of the garden steps, where Sophie always feared he would break his neck. The path was undoubtedly an ancient right of way, and at 10:45 p.m. on Saturdays Skim remembered it was his duty to posterity to keep it open. Till Mrs. Cloak spoke to him once. She spoke likewise to her daughter Mary, sewing maid at Pardon's, and to Mary's new friend, the 5'7" imported London housemaid, who taught Mary to trim hats and found the county dullish. But there was no noise. At no time was there any noise, and when Sophie walked abroad, she met no one in her path unless she had signified a wish that way. Then they appeared to protest that all was well with them and their children, their chickens, their roofs, their water supply, and their sons in the police or the railway service. "But don't you find it dull, dear?" said George, loyally doing his best not to worry as the months went by. "I've been so busy putting my house in order, I haven't had time to think," said she. "Do you?" "No, no. If I could only be sure of you." She turned on the green drawing-room's couch, it was Empire, not Applewhite after all, and laid aside a list of linen and blankets. "It has changed everything, hasn't it?" she whispered. "Oh Lord, yes. But I still think if we went back to Baltimore and missed our first real summer together, no, thank you, my lord. But we're absolutely alone. Isn't that what I'm doing my best to remedy?" "Don't you worry. I like it. Like it to the marrow of my little bones. You don't realize what her house means to a woman. We thought we were living in it last year, but we hadn't begun to. Don't you rejoice in your study, George? I prefer being here with you." He sat down on the floor by the couch and took her hand. "7," she said, as the French clock struck. "Year before last you'd just be coming back from business." He winced at the recollection, then laughed. "Business! I've been at work 10 solid hours today." "Where did you lunch? With the Conants?" "No, at Duttonshaw, sitting on a log, with my feet in a swamp. But we found out where the old spring is, and we're going to pipe it down to Galansty next year. I'll come and see tomorrow. Oh, please open the door, dear. I want to look down the passage. Isn't that corner by the stair-head lovely where the sun strikes in?" She looked through half-closed eyes at the vista of ivory white and pale green, all steeped in liquid gold. "There's a step out of Jane Elphick's bedroom," she went on, "and his first step in the world ought to be up. I shouldn't wonder if those people hadn't put it there on purpose. George, will it make any odds to you if he's a girl?" He answered, as he had many times before, that his interest was his wife, not the child. "Then you're the only person who thinks so," she laughed. "Don't be silly, dear. It's expected, I know. It's my duty. I shan't be able to look our people in the face if I fail." "What concern is it of theirs, confound 'em?" "You'll see. Luckily, the tradition of the house is boys, Mrs. Cloak says, so I'm provided for. Shall you ever begin to understand these people? I shan't." "And we bought it for fun. For fun!" he groaned. "And here we are held up for goodness knows how long." "Why? Were you thinking of selling it?" He did not answer. "Do you remember the second Mrs. Chapin?" she demanded. This was a bold, brazen little black-browed woman, a widow for choice, who on Sophie's death was guilefully to marry George for his wealth and ruin him in a year. George being busy, Sophie had invented her some 2 years after her marriage, and conceived she was alone among wives in so doing. "You aren't going to bring her up again?" he asked anxiously. "I only want to say that I should hate anyone who bought pardons 10 times worse than I used to hate the second Mrs. Chapin. Think what we've put into it of our 2 selves." "At least a couple of $1,000,000 I know I could have made," he broke off. "The beasts," she went on. "They'd be sure to build a red brick lodge at the gates, and cut the lawn up for bedding out. You must leave instructions in your will that he's never to do that, George, won't you?" He laughed and took her hand again, but said nothing till it was time to dress. Then he muttered, "What the devil's use is a man's country to him when he can't do business in it?" Friar's Pardon stood faithful to its tradition. At the appointed time was born not that third in their party to whom Sophie meant to be so kind, but a godling. In beauty it was manifest, excellent Eros. as in wisdom Confucius, an enhancer of delights, a renewer of companionships, and an interpreter of destiny. This last George did not realize till he met Lady Conant striding through Dutton Shaw a few days after the event. "My dear fellow," she cried, and slapped him heartily on the back, "I can't tell you how glad we all are. Oh, she'll be all right. There's never been any trouble over the birth of an heir at Pardon's. Now, where the deuce is it?" She felt largely in her leather-bound skirt and drew out a small silver mug. "I sent a note to your wife about it, but my silly ass of a groom forgot to take this. You can save me a trump. Give her my love." She marched off amid her guard of grave Airedales. The mug was worn and dented. Above the twined initials G.L. was the crest of a footless bird, and the motto, "Wait a while, wait a while." "That's the other end of the riddle," Sophie whispered when he saw her that evening. "Read her note. The English write beautiful notes." "The warmest of welcomes to your little man. I hope he will appreciate his native land now he has come to it. Though you have said nothing, we cannot of course look on him as a little stranger, and so I am sending him the old Lashmar christening mug. It has been with us since Gregory Lashmar, your great-grandmother's brother." George stared at his wife. "Go on," she twinkled from the pillows. "Mother's brother sold his place to Walter's family. We seem to have acquired some of your household gods at that time, but nothing survives except the mug and the old cradle, which I found in the potting shed, and am having put in order for you. I hope little George Lashmar, he will be too, won't he, will live to see his grandchildren cut their teeth on his mug. Affectionately yours, Alice Conant. P.S. How quiet you've kept about it all." "Well, "Don't swear," said Sophie, "but for the infant, mind." "But how in the world did she get at it? Have you ever said a word about the Lashmars?" "You know the only time. To young Eagledon at Rockets, when Eagledon died. Your great-grandmother's brother." She traced the whole connection, more than your Aunt Sydney could do. "What does she mean about our keeping quiet?" Sophie's eyes sparkled. "I've thought that out too. We've got back at the English at last. Can't you see that she thought that we thought my mother's being a Lashmar was one of those things we'd expect the English to find out for themselves, and that's impressed her?" She turned the mug in her white hands and sighed happily. "Wait a while, wait a while. That's not a bad motto, George. It's been worth it. But still, I don't quite see. I shouldn't wonder if they don't think our coming here was part of a deep-laid scheme to be near our ancestors. They'd understand that, and look how they've accepted us, all of them." "Are we so undesirable in ourselves?" George grunted. "Be just, my lord. That wretched Sangres man has twice our money. Can you see Marn Conant slapping him between the shoulders? Not by a jackful. The poor beast doesn't exist." "Do you think it's that, then?" He looked toward the cot by the fire, where the godling snorted. "The minute I get well, I shall find out from Mrs. Cloak what every Lashmar gives in doles, that's nicer than tips, every time a Lashmeet is born. I've done my duty thus far, but there's much expected of me." Entered here Mrs. Cloak and hung worshipping over the cot. They showed her the mug, and her face shone. "Oh, now Lady Conant sent it, it'll be all proper, ma'am, won't it? George, of course, he'd have to be, but seeing what he is, we was hoping, all your people was hoping, it would be Lashmar too, and that would just round it out. A very handsome mug, quite unique, I should imagine. Wait a while, wait a while. That's true with the Lashmars, I've heard. Very slow to fill their houses, they are. Most like Master George won't open his nursery till he's 30. "Poor lamb!" cried Sophie. "But how did you know my folk were Lashmars?" Mrs. Cloak thought deeply. "I'm sure I can't quite say, ma'am, but I've a belief likely that it was something you may have let drop to young Eagledon when you was at Rockets. That may have been what give us an inkling. And so it came out, one thing in the way of talk leading to another, and those American people at Veering Holler was very obliging with news, I'm told, ma'am." "Great Scott!" said George under his breath. "And this is the simple peasant!" Yes, Miss Cloak went on, and Cloak was only wondering this afternoon. Your pillow slipped, my dear. You mustn't lie that away. Just for the sake of saying something, whether you wouldn't think, well now, of getting the Lashmore farms back, sir. They don't rightly round off Sir Walter's estate. They come catering across us more. Cloak, he would be glad to show you over any day. But Sir Walter doesn't want to sell, does he? We can find out from his bailiff, sir, but, with cold contempt, I think that trained nurse is just coming up from her dinner, so I'm afraid we'll have to ask you, sir. Now, Master George, aye, wake a little minute, Lummy. A few months later, the three of them were down at the brook in the Gale Anstey woods to consider the rebuilding of a footbridge carried away by spring floods. George Lashmar Chapin wanted all the bluebells on God's earth that day to eat, and Sophie adored him in a voice like to the cooing of a dove. So business was delayed. Here's the place, said his father at last among the water forget-me-nots. But where the deuce are the larch poles, Cloak? I told you to have them down here already. We'll get 'em down, if you say so, Cloak answered, with a thrust of the under lip they both knew. But I did say so. What on earth have you brought that timber tag here for? We aren't building a railway bridge. Why, in America, half a dozen 2x4 bits would be ample. I don't know nothing about that, said Cloak, and I've nothing to say against larch, if you want to make a temporary job of it. I ain't here to tell you what isn't so, sir, and you can't say I ever come creeping up on you, or trying to lead you further in than you set out. A year ago, George would have danced with impatience. Now he scraped a little mud off his old gaiters with his spade and waited. All I say is that you can put up larch and make a temporary job of it, and by the time the young master's married it'll have to be done again. Now, I've brought down a couple of as sweet 6x8 oak timbers as I've ever drawed. You put 'em in, and it's off your mind for good and all. T'other way, I don't say it ain't right, I'm only just saying what I think, but t'other way, he'll no sooner be married than he'll have it all to do again. You've no call to regard my words, but you can't get out of that. No, said George after a pause. I've been realizing that for some time. Make it oak then, we can't get out of it. End of section 1.
Ballyclare, Northern Ireland. Actions and Reactions by Rudyard Kipling. Chapter 2. The Recall. I am the land of their fathers. In me the virtue stays. I will bring back my children after certain days. Under their feet, in the grasses, my clinging magic runs. They shall return as strangers, they shall remain as sons. Over their heads, in the branches of their new-bought ancient trees, I weave an incantation, and draw them to my knees. Scent of smoke in the evening, smell of rain in the night, the hours, the days, and the sea suns, order their souls aright. Till I make the meaning of all my thousand years, till I fill their hearts with knowledge, while I fill their eyes with tears. End of section 2. Recording by Chad Horner from Ballyclare, Northern Ireland.
Actions and Reactions by Rudyard Kipling. Garm, a hostage. One night a very long time ago I drove to an Indian military cantonment called Mianmir to see amateur theatricals. At the back of the infantry barracks a soldier, his cap over one eye, rushed in front of the horses and shouted that he was a dangerous highway robber. As a matter of fact, he was a friend of mine, so I told him to go home before anyone caught him. But he fell under the pole, and I heard voices of a military guard in search of someone. The driver and I coaxed him into the carriage, drove home swiftly, undressed him, and put him to bed, where he waked next morning with a sore headache, very much ashamed. When his uniform was cleaned and dried, and he had been shaved and washed and made neat, I drove him back to barracks with his arm in a fine white sling, and reported that I had accidentally run over him. I did not tell this story to my friend's sergeant, who was a hostile and unbelieving person, but to his lieutenant, who did not know us quite so well. 3 days later my friend came to call, and at his heels slobbered and fawned one of the finest bull terriers of the old-fashioned breed, 2 parts bull and 1 terrier, that I had ever set eyes on. He was pure white, with a fawn-colored saddle just behind his neck, and a fawn diamond at the root of his thin whippy tail. I had admired him distantly for more than a year, and Vixen, my own fox terrier, knew him too, but did not approve. "Ease for you," said my friend, but he did not look as though he liked parting with him. "Nonsense! That dog's worth more than most men, Stanley," I said. "Ease that and more. 'Tention." The dog rose on his hind legs and stood upright for a full minute. "Eyes right." He sat on his haunches and turned his head sharp to the right. At a sign he rose and barked thrice. Then he shook hands with his right paw and bounded lightly to my shoulder. Here he made himself into a necktie, limp and lifeless, hanging down on either side of my neck. I was told to pick him up and throw him in the air. He fell with a howl and held up one leg. "Part of the trick," said his owner. "You're going to die now. Dig yourself your little grave and shut your little eye." Still limping, the dog hobbled to the garden edge, dug a hole, and lay down in it. When told that he was cured, he jumped out, wagging his tail, and whining for applause. He was put through half a dozen other tricks, such as showing how he would hold a man safe. I was that man, and he sat down before me, his teeth bared, ready to spring, and how he would stop eating at the word of command. I had no more than finished praising him when my friend made a gesture that stopped the dog as though he had been shot, took a piece of blue ruled canteen paper from his helmet, handed it to me, and ran away, while the dog looked after him and howled. I read: "Sir, I give you the dog because of what you got me out of. He is the best I know, for I made him myself, and he is as good as a man. Please do not give him too much to eat, and please do not give him back to me, for I'm not going to take him if you will keep him. So please do not try to give him back any more. I have kept his name back, so you can call him anything, and he will answer. But please do not give him back. He can kill a man as easy as anything, but please do not give him too much meat. He knows more than a man." Vixen sympathetically joined her shrill little yap to the bull terrier's despairing cry, and I was annoyed, for I knew that a man who cares for a dog is one thing, but a man who loves one dog is quite another. Dogs are at the best no more than verminous vagrants, self-scratchers, foul-feeders, and unclean by the law of Moses and Mohammed. But a dog with whom one lives alone for at least 6 months in the year, a free thing tied to you so strictly by love that without you he will not stir or exercise, a patient, temperate, humorous, wise soul who knows your moods before you know them yourself, is not a dog under any ruling. I had Vixen, who was all my dog to me, and I felt what my friend must have felt at tearing out his heart in this style and leaving it in my garden. However, the dog understood clearly enough that I was his master, and did not follow the soldier. As soon as he drew breath, I made much of him, and Vixen, yelling with jealousy, flew at him. Had she been of his own sex, he might have cheered himself with a fight, but he only looked worriedly when she nipped his deep iron sides, laid his heavy head on my knee, and howled anew. I meant to dine at the club that night, but as darkness drew in, and the dog snuffed through the empty house like a child trying to recover from a fit of sobbing, I felt that I could not leave him to suffer his first evening alone. So we fed at home, Vixen on one side and the stranger dog on the other, she watching his every mouthful and saying explicitly what she thought of his table manners, which were much better than hers. It was Vixen's custom, till the weather grew hot, to sleep in my bed, her head on the pillow like a Christian, and when morning came I would always find that the little thing had braced her feet against the wall and pushed me to the very edge of the cot. This night she hurried to bed purposefully, every hair up, one eye on the stranger, who had dropped on a mat in a helpless, hopeless sort of way, all 4 feet spread out, sighing heavily. She settled her head on the pillow several times to show her little airs and graces, and struck up her usual whiny sing-song before slumber. The stranger dog softly edged toward me. I put out my hand and he licked it. Instantly my wrist was between Vixen's teeth, and her warning "Arr!" said as plainly as speech that if I took any further notice of the stranger she would bite. I caught her behind her fat neck with my left hand, shook her severely, and said, "Vixen, if you do that again, you'll be put into the veranda. Now remember." She understood perfectly, but the minute I released her, she mouthed my right wrist once more, and waited with her ears back and all her body flattened, ready to bite. The big dog's tail thumped the floor in a humble and peace-making way. I grabbed Vixen a second time, lifted her out of bed like a rabbit. She hated that and yelled, and as I had promised, set her out in the veranda with the bats and the moonlight. At this she howled. Then she used coarse language, not to me, but to the bull terrier, till she coughed with exhaustion. Then she ran round the house, trying every door. Then she went off to the stables and barked as though some one were stealing the horses, which was an old trick of hers. Last she returned, and her snuffing yelp said, "I'll be good, let me in, and I'll be good." She was admitted and flew to her pillow. When she was quieted, I whispered to the other dog, "You can lie on the foot of the bed." The bull jumped up at once, and though I felt Vixen quiver with rage, she knew better than to protest. So we slept till the morning, and they had early breakfast with me, bite for bite, till the horse came round, and we went for a ride. I don't think the bull had ever followed a horse before. He was wild with excitement, and Vixen, as usual, squealed and scuttered and scooted, and took charge of the procession. There was one corner of a village near by which we generally passed with caution, because all the yellow pariah dogs of the place gathered about it. They were half wild, starving beasts, and though utter cowards, yet where 9 or 10 of them get together they will mob and kill and eat an English dog. I kept a whip with a long lash for them. That morning they attacked Vixen, who, perhaps of design, had moved from beyond my horse's shadow. The bull was plowing along in the dust, 50 yards behind, rolling in his run, and smiling as bull terriers will. I heard Vixen squeal. Half a dozen of the curs closed in on her. A white streak came up behind me. A cloud of dust rose near Vixen, and when it cleared I saw one tall pariah with his back broken, and the bull wrenching another to earth. Vixen retreated to the protection of my whip, and the bull paddled back, smiling more than ever, covered with the blood of his enemies. That decided me to call him Garin of the Bloody Breast, who was a great person in his time, or Garm for short. So, leaning forward, I told him what his temporary name would be. He looked up while I repeated it, and then raced away. I shouted "Garin." He stopped, raced back, and came up to ask my will. Then I saw that my soldier friend was right, and that that dog knew and was worth more than a man. At the end of the ride I gave an order which Vixen knew and hated. "Go away and get washed," I said. Garin understood some part of it, and Vixen interpreted the rest, and the two trotted off together soberly. When I went to the back veranda, Vixen had been washed snowy white, and was very proud of herself, but the dog boy would not touch Garm on any account unless I stood by. So I waited while he was being scrubbed, and Garm, with the soap creaming on the top of his broad head, looked at me to make sure that this was what I expected him to endure. He knew perfectly that the dog boy was only obeying orders. Another time I said to the dog boy, "You will wash the great dog with Vixen when I send them home." "Does he know?" said the dog boy, who understood the ways of dogs. "Garm," I said, "another time you will be washed with Vixen." I knew that Garm understood. Indeed, next washing day, when Vixen, as usual, fled under my bed, Garm stared at the doubtful dog boy in the veranda, stalked to the place where he had been washed last time, and stood rigid in the tub. But the long days in my office tried him sorely. We three would drive off in the morning, at 8:30 and come home at 6 or later. Vixen, knowing the routine of it, went to sleep under my table, but the confinement ate into Garm's soul. He generally sat on the veranda looking out on the Mall, and well I knew what he expected. Sometimes a company of soldiers would move along on their way to the fort, and Garm rolled forth to inspect them, or an officer in uniform entered into the office, and it was pitiful to see poor Garm's welcome to the cloth, not the man. He would leap at him and sniff and bark joyously, then run to the door and back again. One afternoon I heard him bay with a full throat, a thing I had never heard before, and he disappeared. When I drove into my garden at the end of the day, a soldier in white uniform scrambled over the wall at the far end, and the Garm that met me was a joyous dog. This happened twice or thrice a week for a month. I pretended not to notice, but Garm knew, and Vixen knew. He would glide homewards from the office about 4 o'clock, as though he were only going to look at the scenery, and this he did so quietly that but for Vixen I should not have noticed him. The jealous little dog under the table would give a sniff and a snort, just loud enough to call my attention to the flight. Garm might go out 40 times in the day, and Vixen would never stir, but when he slunk off to see his true master in my garden, she told me in her own tongue. That was the one sign she made to prove that Garm did not altogether belong to the family. They were the best of friends at all times, but Vixen explained that I was never to forget Garm did not love me as she loved me. I never expected it. The dog was not my dog, could never be my dog, and I knew he was as miserable as his master, who tramped 8 miles a day to see him. So it seemed to me that the sooner the two were reunited, the better for all. One afternoon I sent Vixen home alone in the dog cart. Garm had gone before, and rode over to cantonments to find another friend of mine, who was an Irish soldier and a great friend of the dog's master. I explained the whole case, and wound up with, "And now Stanley's in my garden crying over his dog. Why doesn't he take him back? They're both unhappy." "Unhappy? There's no sense in the little man any more. But 'tis his fit." "What is his fit? He travels 50 miles a week to see the brute, and he pretends not to notice me when he sees me on the road, and I'm as unhappy as he is. Make him take the dog back." "It's his penance he's set himself. I told him by way of a joke, after you'd run over him so convenient that night when he was drunk, I said if he was a Catholic he'd do penance. Off he went with that fit in his little head and a dose of fever, and nothing would suit but giving you the dog as a hostage." "Hostage for what? I don't want hostages from Stanley." "For his good behavior. He's keeping straight now, the way it's no pleasure to associate wid him." "Has he taken the pledge? If 'twas only that I need not care. Ye can take the pledge for 3 months on and off. He says he'll never see the dog again, and so, mark you, he'll keep straight for evermore. Ye know his fits. Well, this is one of them. How's the dog taken it?" "Like a man. He's the best dog in India. Can't you make Stanley take him back?" "I can do no more than I have done, but ye know his fits. He's just doing his penance. What will he do when he goes to the hills? The doctors put him on the list." It is the custom in India to send a certain number of invalids from each regiment up to stations in the Himalayas for the hot weather, and though the men ought to enjoy the cool and the comfort, they miss the society of the barracks down below, and do their best to come back or to avoid going. I felt that this move would bring matters to a head, so I left Terence hopefully, though he called after me, "He won't take the dog, sor." "You can lay your month's pay on that. Ye know his fits." I never pretended to understand Private Ortheris, and so I did the next best thing. I left him alone. That summer the invalids of the regiment to which my friend belonged were ordered off to the hills early, because the doctors thought marching in the cool of the day would do them good. Their route lay south to a place called Umballa, 120 miles or more. Then they would turn east and march up into the hills to Kasauli, or Dugshai, or Sabathu. I dined with the officers the night before they left. They were marching at 5 in the morning. It was midnight when I drove into my garden and surprised a white figure flying over the wall. "That man," said my butler, "has been here since 9, making talk to that dog. He is quite mad." I did not tell him to go away because he has been here many times before, and because the dog boy told me that if I told him to go away, that great dog would immediately slay me. He did not wish to speak to the protector of the poor, and he did not ask for anything to eat or drink. Qadir Baksh, said I, that was well done, for the dog would surely have killed thee. But I do not think the white soldier will come any more. Garm slept ill that night and whimpered in his dreams. Once he sprang up with a clear, ringing bark, and I heard him wag his tail till it waked him, and the bark died out in a howl. He had dreamed he was with his master again, and I nearly cried. It was all Stanley's silly fault. The first halt which the detachment of invalids made was some miles from their barracks, on the Amritsar road, and 10 miles distant from my house. By a mere chance, one of the officers drove back for another good dinner at the club. Cooking on the line of march is always bad, and there I met him. He was a particular friend of mine, and I knew that he knew how to love a dog properly. His pet was a big fat retriever who was going up to the hills for his health, and though it was still April, the round brown brute puffed and panted in the club veranda as though he would burst. "It's amazing," said the officer, "what excuses these invalids of mine make to get back to barracks. There's a man in my company now asked me for leave to go back to cantonments to pay a debt he'd forgotten. I was so taken by the idea I let him go, and he jingled off in an ekka as pleased as Punch. 10 miles to pay a debt. Wonder what it was really." "If you'll drive me home, I think I can show you," I said. So he went over to my house in his dog cart with the retriever, and on the way I told him the story of Garm. "I was wondering where that brute had gone to. He's the best dog in the regiment," said my friend. "I offered the little fellow 20 rupees for him a month ago. But he's a hostage, you say, for Stanley's good conduct. Stanley's one of the best men I have when he chooses." "That's the reason why," I said. "A second-rate man wouldn't have taken things to heart as he has done." We drove in quietly at the far end of the garden and crept round the house. There was a place close to the wall, all grown about with tamarisk trees, where I knew Garm kept his bones. Even Vixen was not allowed to sit near it. In the full Indian moonlight I could see a white uniform bending over the dog. "Good bye, old man." We could not help hearing Stanley's voice. "For Eving's sake, don't get bit and go mad by any measly pie dog. But you can look after yourself, old man. You don't get drunk and run about it'n your friends. You takes your bones and you eats your biscuit, and you kills your enemy like a gentleman. I'm going away, don't owl. I'm going off to Kasauli, where I won't see you no more." I could hear him holding Garm's nose as the dog threw it up to the stars. "You'll stay here and be'ave, and I'll go away and try to be'ave, and I don't know 'ow to leave you. I don't know." "I think this is damn silly," said the officer, patting his foolish, fubsy old retriever. He called to the private, who leaped to his feet, marched forward, and saluted. "You here?" said the officer, turning away his head. "Yes, sir, but I'm just going back." "I shall be leaving here at 11 in my cart. You come with me. I can't have sick men running about all over the place. Report yourself at 11 here." We did not say much when we went indoors, but the officer muttered and pulled his retriever's ears. He was a disgraceful, overfed doormat of a dog, and when he waddled off to my cookhouse to be fed, I had a brilliant idea. At 11 o'clock that officer's dog was nowhere to be found, and you never heard such a fuss as his owner made. He called and shouted and grew angry and hunted through my garden for half an hour. Then I said, "He's sure to turn up in the morning. Send a man in by rail, and I'll find the beast and return him." "Beast!" said the officer. "I value that dog considerably more than I value any man I know. It's all very fine for you to talk. Your dog's here." So she was under my feet, and had she been missing, food and wages would have stopped in my house till her return. But some people grow fond of dogs not worth a cut of the whip. My friend had to drive away at last with Stanley in the back seat, and then the dog boy said to me, "What kind of animal is Bulan Sahib's dog? Look at him." I went to the boy's hut, and the fat old reprobate was lying on a mat, carefully chained up. He must have heard his master calling for 20 minutes, but had not even attempted to join him. "He has no face," said the dog boy scornfully. "He is a Paniar Cooter, a spaniel. He never tried to get that cloth off his jaws when his master called. Now, Vixen Baba, would have jumped through the window, and that great dog would have slain me with his muzzled mouth. It is true that there are many kinds of dogs. Next evening, who should turn up but Stanley? The officer had sent him back 14 miles by rail with a note begging me to return the retriever if I had found him, and if I had not, to offer huge rewards. The last train to camp left at 10:30, and Stanley stayed till 10 talking to Garm. I argued and entreated, and even threatened to shoot the bull terrier, but the little man was as firm as a rock, though I gave him a good dinner and talked to him most severely. Garm knew as well as I that this was the last time he could hope to see his man, and followed Stanley like a shadow. The retriever said nothing, but licked his lips after his meal and waddled off without so much as saying thank you to the disgusted dog boy. So that last meeting was over, and I felt as wretched as Garm, who moaned in his sleep all night. When we went to the office, he found a place under the table close to Vixen, and dropped flat till it was time to go home. There was no more running out into the verandas, no slinking away for stolen talks with Stanley. As the weather grew warmer, the dogs were forbidden to run beside the cart, but sat at my side on the seat, Vixen with her head under the crook of my left elbow, and Garm hugging the left handrail. Here Vixen was ever in great form. She had to attend to all the moving traffic, such as bullock carts that blocked the way, and camels and led ponies, as well as to keep up her dignity when she passed low friends running in the dust. She never yapped for yapping's sake, but her shrill, high bark was known all along the mall, and other men's terriers ki-yied in reply, and bullock drivers looked over their shoulders and gave us the road with a grin. But Garm cared for none of these things. His big eyes were on the horizon, and his terrible mouth was shut. There was another dog in the office who belonged to my chief. We called him Bob the librarian, because he always imagined vain rats behind the bookshelves, and in hunting for them would drag out half the old newspaper files. Bob was a well-meaning idiot, but Garm did not encourage him. He would slide his head round the door panting, "Rats, come along, Garm," and Garm would shift one forepaw over the other, and curl himself round, leaving Bob to whine at a most uninterested back. The office was nearly as cheerful as a tomb in those days. Once, and only once, did I see Garm at all contented with his surroundings. He had gone for an unauthorized walk with Vixen early one Sunday morning, and a very young and foolish artilleryman, his battery had just moved to that part of the world, tried to steal them both. Vixen, of course, knew better than to take food from soldiers, and besides, she had just finished her breakfast. So she trotted back with a large piece of the mutton that they issued to our troops, laid it down on my veranda, and looked up to see what I thought. I asked her where Garin was, and she ran in front of the horse to show me the way. About a mile up the road we came across our artilleryman sitting very stiffly on the edge of a culvert with a greasy handkerchief on his knees. Garin was in front of him, looking rather pleased. When the man moved leg or hand, Garin bared his teeth in silence. A broken string hung from his collar, and the other half of it lay, all warm, in the artilleryman's still hand. He explained to me, keeping his eyes straight in front of him, that he had met this dog, he called him awful names, walking alone, and was going to take him to the fort to be killed for a masterless pariah. I said that Garin did not seem to me much of a pariah, but that he had better take him to the fort if he thought best. He said he did not care to do so. I told him to go to the fort alone. He said he did not want to go at that hour, but would follow my advice as soon as I had called off the dog. I instructed Garin to take him to the fort, and Garm marched him solemnly up to the gate, 1.5 miles under a hot sun, and I told the quarter guard what had happened. But the young artilleryman was more angry than was at all necessary when they began to laugh. Several regiments, he was told, had tried to steal Garm in their time. That month the hot weather shut down in earnest, and the dogs slept in the bathroom on the cool, wet bricks where the bath is placed. Every morning, as soon as the man filled my bath, the two jumped in, and every morning the man filled the bath a second time. I said to him that he might as well fill a small tub specially for the dogs. "Nay," said he, smiling, "it is not their custom. They would not understand. Besides, the big bath gives them more space." The punkah coolies who pull the punkahs day and night came to know Garin intimately. He noticed that when the swaying fan stopped, I would call out to the coolie and bid him pull with a long stroke. If the man still slept, I would wake him up. He discovered, too, that it was a good thing to lie in the wave of air under the punkah. Maybe Stanley had taught him all about this in barracks. At any rate, when the punkah stopped, Garin would first growl and cock his eye at the rope, and if that did not wake the man, it nearly always did, he would tiptoe forth and talk in the sleeper's ear. Vixen was a clever little dog, but she could never connect the punkah and the coolie, so Garin gave me grateful hours of cool sleep. But he was utterly wretched, as miserable as a human being, and in his misery he clung so closely to me that other men noticed it and were envious. If I moved from one room to another, Garin followed. If my pen stopped scratching, Garm's head was thrust into my hand. If I turned, half awake, on the pillow, Garm was up and at my side, for he knew that I was his only link with his master. And day and night and day, his eyes asked one question: when is this going to end? Living with the dog as I did, I never noticed that he was more than ordinarily upset by the hot weather, till one day at the club a man said, "That dog of yours will die in a week or two. He's a shadow." Then I dosed Garin with iron and quinine, which he hated, and I felt very anxious. He lost his appetite, and Vixen was allowed to eat his dinner under his eyes. Even that did not make him swallow, and we held a consultation on him of the best man doctor in the place, a lady doctor who cured the sick wives of kings, and the Deputy Inspector General of the Veterinary Service of all India. They pronounced upon his symptoms, and I told them his story, and Garm lay on a sofa licking my hand. "He's dying of a broken heart," said the lady doctor suddenly. "'Pon my word," said the Deputy Inspector General, "I believe Mrs. McCrea is perfectly right as usual." The best man doctor in the place wrote a prescription, and the veterinary Deputy Inspector General went over it afterwards to be sure that the drugs were in the proper dog proportions, and that was the first time in his life that our doctor ever allowed his prescriptions to be edited. It was a strong tonic, and it put the dear boy on his feet for a week or two. Then he lost flesh again. I asked a man I knew to take him up to the hills with him when he went, and the man came to the door with his kit packed on the top of the carriage. Garin took in the situation at one red glance. The hair rose along his back. He sat down in front of me and delivered the most awful growl I've ever heard in the jaws of a dog. I shouted to my friend to get away at once, and as soon as the carriage was out of the garden, Garin laid his head on my knee and whined. So I knew his answer and devoted myself to getting Stanley's address in the hills. My turn to go to the cool came late in August. We were allowed 30 days' holiday in a year, if no one fell sick, and we took it as we could be spared. My chief and Bob the librarian had their holiday first, and when they were gone I made a calendar, as I always did, and hung it up at the head of my cot, tearing off one day at a time till they returned. Vixen had gone up to the hills with me 5 times before, and she appreciated the cold and the damp and the beautiful wood fires there as much as I did. "Garm," I said, "we are going back to Stanley at Kasauli. Kasauli, Stanley, Stanley, Kasauli." And I repeated it 20 times. It was not Kasauli really, but another place. Still I remembered what Stanley had said in my garden on the last night, and I dared not change the name. Then Garm began to tremble. Then he barked, and then he leaped up at me, frisking and wagging his tail. "Not now," I said, holding up my hand. "When I say go, we'll go, Garm." I pulled out the little blanket coat and spike collar that Vixen always wore up in the hills to protect her against sudden chills and thieving leopards, and I let the two smell them and talk it over. What they said, of course, I do not know, but it made a new dog of Garm. His eyes were bright, and he barked joyfully when I spoke to him. He ate his food, and he killed his rats for the next 3 weeks, and when he began to whine, I had only to say, "Stanley, Kasauli, Kasauli, Stanley," to wake him up. I wish I had thought of it before. My chief came back, all brown with living in the open air, and very angry at finding it so hot in the plains. That same afternoon we 3 and Kadir Buksh began to pack for our month's holiday, Vixen rolling in and out of the bullock trunk 20 times a minute, and Garm grinning all over and thumping on the floor with his tail. Vixen knew the routine of traveling as well as she knew my office work. She went to the station, singing songs on the front seat of the carriage, while Garin sat with me. She hurried into the railway carriage, saw Kadir Buksh make up my bed for the night, got her drink of water, and curled up with her black patched eye on the tumult of the platform. Garin followed her. The crowd gave him a lane all to himself, and sat down on the pillows with his eyes blazing and his tail a haze behind him. We came to Umballa in the hot, misty dawn. 4 or 5 men, who had been working hard for 11 months, shouting for our dales, the 2-horse traveling carriages that were to take us up to Kalka at the foot of the hills. It was all new to Garm. He did not understand carriages where you lay at full length on your bedding, but Vixen knew and hopped into her place at once, Garin following. The Kalka road, before the railway was built, was about 47 miles long, and the horses were changed every 8 miles. Most of them jibbed and kicked and plunged, but they had to go, and they went rather better than usual for Garm's deep bay in their rear. There was a river to be forded, and 4 bullocks pulled the carriage, and Vixen stuck her head out of the sliding door and nearly fell into the water while she gave directions. Garin was silent and curious, and rather needed reassuring about Stanley and Casale. So we rolled, barking and yelping, into Kalka for lunch, and Garm ate enough for 2. After Kalka, the road wound among the hills, and we took a curricle with half-broken ponies, which were changed every 6 miles. No one dreamed of a railroad to Simla in those days, for it was 7,000 feet up in the air. The road was more than 50 miles long, and the regulation pace was just as fast as the ponies could go. Here again Vixen led Garm from one carriage to the other, jumped into the back seat, and shouted. A cool breath from the snows met us about 5 miles out of Kalka, and she whined for her coat, wisely fearing a chill on the liver. I had had one made for Garm too, and as we climbed to the fresh breezes, I put it on, and Garm chewed it uncomprehendingly, but I think he was grateful. Hi-yi-yi-yi, sang Vixen as we shot round the curves. Toot, 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 went the driver's bugle at the dangerous places, and yow, yow, bayed Garm. Kadir Baksh sat on the front seat and smiled. Even he was glad to get away from the heat of the plains that stewed in the haze behind us. Now and then we would meet a man we knew going down to his work again, and he would say, "What's it like below?" And I would shout, "Hotter than cinders." "What's it like up above?" And he would shout back, "Just perfect," and away we would go. Suddenly Kadir Baksh said over his shoulder, "Here is Solon," and Garm snored where he lay with his head on my knee. Solon is an unpleasant little cantonment, but it has the advantage of being cool and healthy. It is all bare and windy, and one generally stops at a rest house near by for something to eat. I got out and took both dogs with me, while Kadir Baksh made tea. A soldier told us we should find Stanley out there, nodding his head towards a bare bleak hill. When we climbed to the top, we spied that very Stanley who had given me all this trouble, sitting on a rock with his face in his hands and his overcoat hanging loose about him. I never saw anything so lonely and dejected in my life as this one little man, crumpled up and thinking on the great gray hillside. Here Garm left me. He departed without a word, and so far as I could see, without moving his legs. He flew through the air bodily, and I heard the whack of him as he flung himself at Stanley, knocking the little man clean over. They rolled on the ground together, shouting and yelping and hugging. I could not see which was dog and which was man, till Stanley got up and whimpered. He told me that he had been suffering from fever at intervals, and was very weak. He looked all, he said, but even while I watched, both man and dog plumped out to their natural sizes, precisely as dried apples swell in water. Garin was on his shoulder and his breast and feet all at the same time, so that Stanley spoke all through a cloud of Garin, gulping, sobbing, slavering Garm. He did not say anything that I could understand, except that he had fancied he was going to die, but that now he was quite well, and that he was not going to give up Garin any more to anybody under the rank of Beelzebub. Then he said he felt hungry and thirsty and happy. We went down to tea at the rest house, where Stanley stuffed himself with sardines and raspberry jam and beer and cold mutton and pickles when Garm wasn't climbing over him, and then Vixen and I went on. Garm saw how it was at once. He said good-bye to me 3 times, giving me both paws, one after another, and leaping on to my shoulder. He further escorted us, singing hosannas at the top of his voice, a mile down the road. Then he raced back to his own master. Vixen never opened her mouth, but when the cold twilight came, and we could see the lights of Simla across the hills, she snuffled with her nose at the breast of my ulster. I unbuttoned it and tucked her inside. Then she gave a contented little sniff and fell fast asleep, her head on my breast, till we bundled out at Simla, 2 of the 4 happiest people in all the world that night. End of section 3.
Recording by Josh Kibbe. Actions and Reactions by Rudyard Kipling. The Power of the Dog. There is sorrow enough in the natural way, from men and women to fill our day, but when we are certain of sorrow in store, Why do we always arrange for more? Brothers and sisters, I bid you beware of giving your heart to a dog to tear. Buy a pup and your money will buy love unflinching that cannot lie, perfect passion and worship fed by a kick in the ribs or a pat on the head. Nevertheless, it is hardly fair to risk your heart for a dog to tear. When the 14 years which nature permits are closing in asthma or tumor or fits, and the vet's unspoken prescription runs to lethal chambers or loaded guns, then you will find it's your own affair, but you've given your heart to a dog to tear. When the body that lived at your single will, when the whimper of welcome is stilled, how still? When the spirit that answered your every mood is gone wherever it goes for good, you will discover how much you care, and will give your heart to a dog to tear. We've sorrow enough in the natural way, when it comes to burying Christian clay. Our loves are not given, but only lent, at compound interest of cent per cent. Though it is not always the case, I believe, that the longer we've kept 'em, the more do we grieve. For when debts are payable, right or wrong, a short time loan is as bad as a long. So why in heaven, before we are there, should we give our hearts to a dog to tear? End of section 4.
Actions and Reactions by Rudyard Kipling. The Bees and the Flies. A farmer of the Augustan age perused in Virgil's golden page the story of the secret one from Proteus by Cyrene's son, how the dank sea god sowed the swain means to restore his hives again. More briefly, how a slaughtered bull breeds honey by the bellyful. The egregious rustic put to death a bull by stopping of its breath, disposed the carcass in a shed, with fragrant herbs and branches spread, and having thus performed the charm, sat down to wait the promised swarm. Nor waited long. The god of day, impartial, quickening with his ray, evil and good alike beheld the carcass, and the carcass swelled. Big with new birth, the belly heaves beneath its screen of scented leaves. Past any doubt, the bull conceives. The farmer bids men bring more hives to house the profit that arrives, prepares on pan and key and kettle sweet music that shall make 'em settle. But when to crown the work he goes, gods, what a stink salutes his nose! Where are the honest toilers? Where the gravid mistress of their care? A busy scene indeed he sees, but not a sign or sound of bees. Worms of the riper grave unhid by any kindly coffin lid, obscene and shameless to the light, seethe in insatiate appetite through putrid offal, while above the hissing blowfly seeks his love, whose offspring, supping where they supped, consume corruption twice corrupt. End of section 6.